So, okay, I would like to welcome everyone to today's MAI webinar. The topic is Patience and Perseverance, Editing a Book with Several Authors. And our guest speaker today is someone with a lot of experience in that area. And he is Ian Darke, who's the general coordinator of the Letra Viva Publishers Network in Latin America. And he's also coordinating a massive project right now that it's nearing its completion. Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about it, which is the Latin America Bible Commentary. Ian has been a resident of Latin America since 1985, and his ministry passion really has been focused for all that time in ministry among students, as well as the creation and publication of relevant books and materials for Latin American readers. He's originally from the UK. Interestingly, he studied pure mathematics. So that shows you can be both verbal and also oriented toward numbers and the sciences. And he's, by the way, he's a long distance runner. I think that kind of perseverance probably is very helpful in the kind of work that we do in publishing as well. Ian's a longtime friend. He's my elder brother by one day, literally. And he's married to Brenda, and they have 2 children, Chris and Catherine, and 3 granddaughters. So Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you. I want to encourage everybody as you listen to this presentation to be thinking about your questions. You'll see there's a chat box there where you can type in your questions. We'll be watching for those, and there'll be time to answer the questions at the end, or however Ian would like to address those questions as they come. So Ian, just like to turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be able to have this opportunity of sharing with you and sharing a little bit about that experience. And thank you very much, John, for the invitation to come here and to share, and for saying those very nice things about me. John, as you've just heard, is my younger brother by one day. Today, I have a bad cough and cold, which I got yesterday coming back to Costa Rica, where I live. But one of the good things about this sort of presentation is you have no risk of catching any germs from me. So that's a good point about it. The presentation that I want to share with you is about managing and leading projects with a lot of writers, a lot of participants, and I think it's rather like building a house. That you require a lot of different people, and it has a lot of different aspects to it, and all need to be planned together before you build. And then as you're doing the building, to construct it very well. So I want to share with you 7 tips or recommendations, if you like, about working in a project with a lot of people. Now, in my case, the Bible Commentary Project has more than 160 people, which is a lot. But I don't think these things apply just with a project that big. But I think as soon as you're having 4 or 5 people involving in a project, you need to think in a different way about how you plan your publishing project. So here are 7 ideas, 7 principles. And first of all, to have a very clear idea what you're doing. When you're just writing a book or working with a writer, you can vary what you're doing along the way. But when you're working in a project that involves lots of people, I think you need to be very clear about the project, what the plan is. You need to be very clear about who your public is, not just geographically, which area they're going to, but what level of readership, what sort of person. Are they pastors? Are they lay people? Is it for women? Is it for children? Is it for seminary professors? You need to have a clear idea to focus what you're doing on your public. And then the content, exactly what it is you're trying to do, what your message is that you want to put across. And then the style and the length. With all these sort of materials, any sort, there can be different styles, there can be more accessible or more academic. And then you want to have a clear idea about the length, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, when you're developing this plan, particularly when there are lots of people involved, you need to think clearly about the dates that you want to fulfill each section by. because you can't just keep on waiting forever. In my experience, it's very easy to have a very clear plan of who will do what and who will send in their chapters when. But almost inevitably, somebody is going to take a lot longer than the others. And so you need to plan these things and think, what will I do if that important chapter or that section written by an important writer doesn't arrive in time? So you need to think about those dates and synchronize them. And then you need to think about a budget. Now, if you've not done this sort of thing before, you may not have thought that when you have just one writer, somebody, you're publishing a book for one writer, normally you'll pay them royalties, or you may give them some books in advance, or there may be nothing involved. They may just do it for love of ministry. But when you have a number of writers, it becomes very difficult if you try and give royalties, because you've then got to calculate the contribution, the percentage of each writer to the whole work, and then it just gets very complicated. So the normal thing to do is that you agree with each one beforehand. You agree the terms, and in our case, we decide we pay each of the authors according to the number of words of the section that we've asked them to do. That is not the number of words they actually write, because they always write more, but the number that they're commissioned to write. And so each one will be paid something for their work. And again, we'll come back to that in a moment. And then you need to have a very clear idea of who your team is, who your resources are. Now, everyone has different expertise, different strengths. And so for a big project like this, you'll need to have several people who can look after different aspects of the work. And then something really, really important is to have a detailed style guide and rule book. This may sound very trivial or maybe unnecessary, but if you're planning on writing a book of a certain style, if you're just talking with one author, you can understand each other. But when it becomes several, you really need to put something down on paper, that the book is going to be this length, it's going to be written by this time, and the style is going to be this way, and you're going to include, for example, study questions or not. You're going to include a bibliography or not. You're going to, all these different things will come to play. So you need to write all those things down. And if you want to, you can use project planning tools or Gantt charts or spreadsheets if you want to make it really very well organized. But you don't really need to. What you need to do is to have a very clear plan, and whatever means you use to have a clear process. And I'd recommend writing that down and sharing it with other people so that you've got this clear plan. Okay, that's the clear plan. Then the second tip is the importance of communicating very, very clearly. I put a map of Latin America there. We have our writers from all over Latin America on that map. Now, you may not know, but although many of those countries speak Spanish, and Brazil speaks Portuguese, but the Spanish is actually different in each country. And so when we write to people, we have to think carefully about how we write and how we communicate, so everyone agrees and understands what we're doing. And because the project may take a longer period of time, sometimes people forget. They forget they're supposed to be writing something, and they forget how it fits in with other people. So communication is really very important. And I think it's very important to include all your stakeholders, as people say, people involved in the whole project, not just your writers, but also your editors, the people who are going to publish your work. Also, if you have sponsors or donors, people are really interested in the project, and just friends of the project, people are going to pray for it. In our case, we decided to do a very simple bulletin once a month, just to keep people on track and remind them of the bigger picture of what they're doing and how it's coming along. And I can't remember if we mentioned earlier on, in our case, this project has taken 11 years. So there's a lot of bulletins and a lot of communication. Okay, number 3. Again, when you've got a lot of people involved, I think you do need to be very careful about the legal and financial matters. And there is just a picture of a legal contract. This is actually under Costa Rican law. So that every author has a contract which stipulates who they are and what they're doing, how many words they have to give in, and when, and the fact that they will receive some funds for it, and they will then secede their rights. There are many reasons for doing this. So you clarify the details of the payment, the deadlines, and the clarified cession or secession of rights. In other words, for the money they receive, you have the copyright, the rights, intellectual rights over what they've written. Now, maybe if there aren't so many authors, you could vary this a little bit. But the point is, if you're doing a big work, you want to be able to develop that, and every time you reprint, you can't be paying royalties to all the different writers. And you need to be very clear about how this works. Another factor involved is that you don't want in 20 years' time sons or the heirs of one of the writers to say, "You never paid us royalties and we demand royalties." You need to have a piece of paper that's very clear and will make it clear that all the authors have been paid and there's no need to pay any more royalties. So that may seem very legal, but I think these things are important because we hope a big book or that's going to serve the church well will keep being published for 20 years, 30 years. So you want to avoid any confusion in the future. And then you need to keep very accurate accounting and financial records. That's the obvious. Now, this may sound very, very fussy, but I think you need to get a system to manage your documents very, very well. And again, I've just shown you a picture of my computer's file listing, and you can see Chronicas, that's Chronicles, and Reyes, that's Kings, and lots of numbers. Pardon me. And I'll explain those numbers. This is our system that we worked out, and on my computer, on my folder for this Bible commentary, I have more than 4,000 files. So you need to do something to keep all these files in order. So what we do is, for example, the person who's writing, in our case, the commentary of John. So the first document we asked from him is called John 0, and that is the outline. We asked the writer to send just an outline of how they see the chapter, their commentary coming along, and they will send us John 01. And then our editor will have a look at it and might send back John 02, which is maybe include some suggestions and some other things that they've forgotten about. And they might send them back to us on John 03. I hope that makes sense. Then the initial draft, when they sending a draft, the outline may include more or less information. I think we'd include one chapter of the commentary as well. Then the initial draft will come in, and that will be John 1. So they send in John 1:1, and then our editor might send back John 1:2, which again has some comments and suggestions. Maybe they've got the style too academic, or it's too confusing. So our editor will send something back. And then the next level becomes John 2, and that will go back and forth between the editor, in this case, the theological editor. And then when it's properly edited, it will become John 3. Now, it may go from one editor to another. So it may start at John 3:1 to John 3:2 to John 3:3. And then when it's finally approved, it becomes John 4. And then it goes to page design. And when it's page design, it's John 5. Because we had separate files for each of these books. I hope that's not too confusing, but it's the system we've used. Now, when we send articles or sections back to the writers, they will then send to us, very often not following those rules. So they'll send a file, a computer file, it's probably called, maybe called my commentary on John for the CBC, something like that. And so as soon as I get it, I have to change the name they gave to the file to the names we give to our files. Otherwise, we just have loads of files, you've no idea what they are. So we're always making sure that everyone sticks to the same numbering system or naming system for the files. Otherwise, you get into a tremendous confusion. So that may sound very technical, but believe me, these things are very important to avoid confusion. Now, as far as the editing is concerned, you need to make sure you've got a good team who are going to edit. In my experience, in our experience, it's difficult to find, maybe it's different in your country, but in our context, it's difficult to find an editor who can do everything. So this is roughly what a system we've got. I'll explain this a little bit. First of all, you need so think of levels of editing. First of all, preliminary check: has the writer done what was asked for? And this can be something that doesn't require that much reading or that much understanding, but it involves somebody sensible and responsible person who can say, okay, they were supposed to write a commentary on John's Gospel, and it's supposed to have an introduction, it's supposed to have a presentation, it's got the commentary on all the books of all the chapters of that book of the Bible, and has a bibliography at the end. And it's also supposed to have study questions. So it just requires somebody who's got a clear head to go through and just check it's all there. And so very often we found that our writers wrote the commentary but forgot the questions. They don't like writing study questions. So we'd write back saying, oh, very nice, but you forgot the study questions. Or they've written a commentary but forgot to write the introduction. Or they've written everything else and forgot to write the recommended books at the end. So that's the first stage, really just making sure that everything is intact. So then comes to an editor who will read it through and look at the structure and the logic. Now, hopefully your writers write in a very clear way. Some of our writers write in a very muddled up way. They start off with one matter and then go to another and then come back to the first. And reading it, you get really muddled up. And so we found that that's sort of like a preliminary level of editing, just to try and make sense of what they've written. And often, without changing any of their words, just by moving paragraphs around, you can make what they've written into a lot more sense and a lot clearer. And so that's say maybe a first level. And then we have theological editors who will really look at the content. Now, because this is a Bible commentary, we don't want people to write things which are exaggerated or not really very biblical, or we want people to write things that are really, really centered on God's word and going to help people understand that. So our theological editor will look through that and make sure that it's all correct. And one of the big things here is also to find what is not included. That's actually a bit more challenging. So if for example, if it's on a particular issue, it may be very good, but you might think to yourself, they haven't actually dealt with that particular thing. So some of the books of the Bible, we realized that our writers were writing everything, but they missed out some of the more difficult passages, which are precisely the ones people need help on. So that's the theological side. And then once that's clear, and this is always done in relationship with the writer, so you send it back and forth. Then it comes to the level of writing style and level of complexity. So again, making sure that the language flows, it's written well, it's clear, there's no grammatical mistakes, there's no spelling mistakes, that comes, well, the grammar and punctuation come right at the end, really. In our case, we want to make sure the writing style is good. We had the situation of using translated material from Portuguese into Spanish, so the writing style from one language to the other can vary. So we need a lot of help to make sure the style was good, even though it's translated. So having passed through all those levels, you go to page layout and then to proofreading. Can I just say, I can't see if anyone's putting their hand up, I can't see that on my screen. It's disappeared and I can't see how to get it back in. So if anyone does have questions, maybe Ramon or John can help me out.
Yeah, I haven't seen any yet, Ian. So
okay, thank you. It's not, for some reason it disappeared from my screen. Okay, and then tip number 6 would be to look after people and be diplomatic. Now, this may sound very, very obvious, but we're working with people who may have written a lot or may not have written a lot, and everyone has their own sensibilities. One of the things that we learned as we were going along is that we need to remember that people are individuals. And of the group of writers we were working with, right at the beginning, we had a number of situations, our writers had a number of situations, for example, family members who are seriously ill. And so, you know, you can be thinking, oh, my deadline is, you know, we need them to finish this, hand this in by a certain date. But then when you realize that they've actually got family members who are very, very seriously ill, their priority has to be their family. And so you need to be flexible. And we've had some of our writers suffering depression, nothing to do with what they were doing for us, but to do with other things, or passing through a difficult time. Some of them were working for seminaries and lost their jobs, and other matters like that. So we realized that as we're going along, and although it's a lot of people, we do need to remember that personal touch, that our writers are people, and so a little note saying, we're with you, we're concerned for you. And because we have a bulletin that goes out every month, in some of those cases we'd say, you know, we want to pray for you, and can we share that news with a wider group through our bulletin? So that's just a note to remind ourselves to be personally concerned for each of our writers and be nurturing them, helping them, particularly through times of difficulties. So yes, handling emergencies. We had a number of situations where we had people. Now I just had a question and answer just appeared briefly, but it's disappeared. John, can you tell me what?
The question from Eva was, every writer has his or her own style. So in editing, do we have to keep their style or one style for the whole book?
That's a very good question. And now I think it depends on the type of book. I think that would be the main issue. With a Bible commentary, we felt we needed to keep the style much more uniform. And we recognize that writers do have a different style. But because it's a reference work for the whole Bible, we felt in this case it needs to be a much more uniform style. But I think if you were writing a book, for example, I saw our friends from Singapore, they've written a book about people working with folk who have same-sex attraction. And there are a number of different writers for that book. And I think it'd be quite reasonable then to have maybe different styles according to the writers. So I think it depends on the type of book.
Ian, we had a request if you could speak a little bit louder.
Okay, right, I'll try and do that. I think the main problem is my throat. I will have a glass of water and try and speak a bit louder. Is that better? I hope
yes.
It's better. Okay. So, remembering emergencies. In our case, we had some emergencies which were so severe that we in fact had to change the assignment. Several times it happened, in fact. Our writers were writing a commentary and curiously on books like Leviticus or Numbers, and for different family crises reasons, they couldn't complete their work. So we had to graciously say, well, the Lord be with you, and we had to look for a replacement writer. So that's something we had to be prepared to do to continue the work. And then diplomacy. One of the issues that we came across quite a lot is that our writers basically would say, well, okay, I've done the best I can, and I know that the language isn't very good, and I know the study questions aren't there, but someone else can someone else do that? And so we had a lot of people saying, oh, someone can fix that. But the trouble is that we don't have many someones. And so somehow diplomatically, you've got to say, we don't have a big pool of editors and helpers and so on. We're a very small team. And so we diplomatically need to encourage and challenge our writers to do what they're supposed to do and fill in the gaps. Is that okay? Okay. And then keep your goal in mind. I think this is a very important thing, that we can sometimes get overwhelmed by the task and so on. But I think we need to always keep fixed in our mind what it is that we want to do. And what we want to do is not so much publish this book, this commentary. What we want to do is to transform lives. What we want to do is to reach our readers wherever they are with a resource that will really help them grow as a Christian, or become a Christian, or become more mature in their faith, and really bless them. But also, I'd say, and this was the case in our project, to benefit to the authors, to bless the authors, to help them grow, because many of them had not written very much before, or nothing. And so by being involved in this project, in which their part may be very small, they were able to have the experience of writing and presenting material to a wider public. And so we often talk about the double transformation of what we're doing. The transformation that we want to bring about by the printed word going out to people, and also the transformation to the writers themselves. And going back to the communication with the writers, to be aware of those who really have a gift, and to be able to encourage those to go on. In some cases, to go on to study more. In other cases, to write more. One of our writers, for example, did an excellent chapter on a commentary rather, on the book of Job. And it was a very thoughtful piece, and it was very helpful to many. And since then, he's actually been able to write a book on suffering, links naturally with the book of Job. And because he was, and really writes very well, he's written another book, written last year, or earlier this year, on the Reformation. And it's a simple guide for non-Christians about what the Reformation was and is. And so that's been really exciting to see some of these folk who have come in as writers, to see them grow as in their own Christian experience, and to be able to develop that ministry in a wider way. And obviously to keep on praying. And I know I've just put it in there, but that should be something all the way through, that we do pray for these projects. Without exaggerating, but we would say that in many cases we've sensed the devil's opposition with the project to produce the commentary. So many things have cropped up, and we thought, oh no, not another crisis. I'm going from crisis to crisis. But just getting people to pray, and for us to pray and bring things to the Lord, and seeing how we can find a way through these different issues and find good solutions. So that's keeping the bigger picture in view, and not getting too taken up by the details, really.
Ian,
so, like the beautiful house. Yes?
We had a question, maybe this would be a good time since you just got done talking about the authors. This is a question from Jolly. says, have you ever had someone write a contribution and you realize you cannot publish it, either because there's a fundamental moral or theological or other difference that you did?
A very good question. And yes,
how do you
we have.
How do you deal with that?
Well, first of all, going back to the documents at the beginning, having the clear outlines, we use a doctrinal statement, which is a very classic one. It's the same one used by IFES and by the Lausanne Commission, which is very clear. And also in our guidelines that we give out, we talk about in a little more detail that in our case, we're non-denominational, we're trans-denominational, and we don't want to push any particular perspective if it's a particularly denominational issue. But also we are, just to clarify, we are clearly evangelical, and so we need to bear that in mind. And so in some cases we have we've actually paid the author but not used the contribution. That's what we're paying is not a huge amount of money. They've already signed a contract saying we have the rights to produce the book, and we have the rights to actually edit what they've written. But in some cases, we have made the decision not to use what they have written, and we've sought another writer. In other cases, because in the contract it's clear that we're allowed to edit what they've written, we've simply cut out certain sections. That has actually happened quite a few times. But it does require a bit of diplomacy, a bit of explaining. It's an opportunity for growth to help the person understand why we're not including their work or why we're not including a section of their work, that the person needs to have the maturity to understand why it's not being included. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I think that was a good answer.
Yeah, so just summarizing, this house here in the picture is very unrealistic. I make clear this is not my house. It's just an illustration. It's a very beautiful house, and it's all, you can see it's beautiful inside and it's beautiful outside. And I think what we want to produce are materials that are attractive in every way, that they look good, they do the job. It's a functional thing, like this house. You can live in the house, but it just looks good too. And I think that's what we all want to aspire to produce materials that are functional. They do what they're supposed to do. And at the same time, they're written beautifully. And somebody will pick this up and say, what a wonderful book. And then as they read it, they will be transformed for that inner beauty. So that's really sort of 7 thoughts on the producing books with lots of people involved. I think we have a bit of time for questions now. And
yes,
any other comments?
Please take advantage of this time, participants, to type in your questions, and Ian would love to respond, I'm sure.
Yes.
While we're waiting for a question or two here, Ian, could you just describe briefly the process of finding these writers? I mean, you mentioned 160, and just a little bit of how you went about finding these reliable, the good writers.
That's a very good question. I should say that 160 writers were involved, actually so published, and the names were listed just 102. And the reason is that some of those 160 helped out with one particular book or one particular article. And so they're acknowledged in another section, but we actually pared it down to 102 who are named as authors of this book. But yeah, the question is, how do you find people? And in this case, we work with a small team, a committee. And so we would meet together, and basically we would brainstorm who knows who. In this case, people who can write on books of the Bible. Now, it's perhaps different in your context, but in our context, there are lots of people who can write on the New Testament, and people who have maybe higher degrees, or they can read the Greek, and they can write a nice commentary on a New Testament book. But it's very different in the Old Testament. In Latin America, there are far fewer people who have training and expertise in the Old Testament and would be prepared to write a commentary on maybe a difficult book for the Old Testament. And so it was very important that we meet together as a team, and then we ask advisors. So as we got to know people who have that experience, we just asked and asked, and the network went out asking people, who do you know who could write on 1 Chronicles, for example, or on Leviticus? So they were the sort of questions that we would ask people, and thankfully we were put in touch with people, and our network grew, and we would contact people and so on. We also used Google. Actually, we just some cases would write to see who had written something on a certain book, and occasionally, that not always happened, but occasionally that gave us a new lead to find another writer.
Thanks, Ian. Chelsea has a question. Did you assign authors to specific editors? And then also, how does your team transmit files?
Right. Okay. We had, for the theological side, we had an Old Testament editor and a New Testament editor. But that is quite a big area, so we divided that up. Editors they may be good in the subject matter, but may not be so good in communication with their writer, and so we adjusted that a little bit to find who can be good at keeping in touch with the writer and who would actually do the final editing. So sometimes we paired them up. So our structure there was not very logical. It was based on a one-by-one basis. We tried to work out who could do the contact with the writer and who could do the more detailed editing of the work. And what was your second question? Sorry.
How do you transmit files? How do you send the files?
Oh, right, yes. Well, these are text files, so they're just sent by email and as an attachment. So as long as everyone has email, all of our writers did. I don't think any of our writers didn't have email. That would be a problem if they don't have email. Mm-hmm. But we would send them that way. But none of the files, even for a big book, because it's just sheer text, and we're using Word or a program like that. So a text file doesn't have to be very large. Clearly, we don't want anyone to put other things in the text, like pictures or whatever, because that's part of the publisher's job. So we've asked our writers simply just to send text, just plain text, which could be a text file or an RTF file.
Thank you. And here's a question from Eva. It relates to the editorial process. She asks, how about editing the translation of this kind of book? Do we have to keep the original style or adjust it to the culture and style of that language and reader?
Right. Again, a very interesting question. Now, in our case, this is a Latin American Bible commentary. Some of it's written in Spanish, some are written in Portuguese. So we actually come across this twice. The first of all, to get it all into Spanish. So we've got people writing in Portuguese from the Brazilian context, and we need to get that into Spanish. Now, not all of those writers writing from Brazil, not all of them were really engaging much with their own culture, curiously enough. So sometimes we have to challenge them to think more about their own culture and respond to their own culture. So then coming into Spanish, that was quite hard work to make sure the style was really good in Spanish, the style. But also any application to the culture, we had to work out how to manage that. We then have the second phase, which is now the whole book is in Spanish, the whole commentary, and it is being translated. It's got two translations. One all into Portuguese, and the other has been translated into English. So in those cases, for example, the English translation, the publisher wants it to be a Latin American Bible commentary. So they want the flavor of Latin America. They want to see how commentators related to issues within Latin America. So it's a delicate art, I think, to manage the level of style and the adjustment. I think in our case, we going from Portuguese to Spanish, the cultures are not that different. The whole issue is, for us, is much bigger when, if anyone translates from English from the USA, for example, into Spanish for Latin America, then the cultural question becomes much bigger.
Thank you. And here's a question. We're getting down to the nitty gritty, a question about finances. Regarding finances, Barbara asks, how are the team members paid as the project progresses, i.e. coordinator, editors, and when are the authors paid? And did you need to have a pool of funds before the project was started?
Right, very important issues, yes. And again, this is all part of, like the biblical principle of sort of calculating what you can do before you start. Right, in our case, editors were paid. Our editors were staff of Bible seminaries, Bible colleges, and we negotiated with the Bible college to release them for the time needed. So we had to pay the equivalent of their salary in the Bible college. Other folk did not need to be paid and did it ad honorem. But the writers we paid on a word by word basis, which meant that for somebody writing the commentary on Philemon, for example, received maybe $20, and whereas the writer of a larger book, Matthew, for example, might have received $2,000, because it depends on the number of words they're assigned. So in our case, we had, thankfully, a couple of donors who were able to and prepared to put in a serious amount of funding to the project. And it's a delicate matter, really, but I think if the book is worth doing and you really feel that it needs this sort of time, it's hard to find the publishers themselves, who have the funds to be able to invest into a big project. Hopefully that would be the case. If the project is smaller, hopefully the publisher would say, okay, we're prepared to invest this amount of money. And you can calculate, if you say, well, it'll take 2 years and we have 5 authors and we need to pay them so much. You can prepare a budget in advance, but you need to build in those things. Otherwise you just run out of money and have a project that's is half done.
Yeah, I really commend you on the professionalism, particularly in terms of the finances and the contracts, and just really excellent to hear. I don't see any other questions. I'd like to ask one, Ian. I think all of us have been in a project at some point in our lives where we just see, wow, I had never realized this would become such a massive undertaking, that so much time would be involved. Just tell us a little bit about what encouraged you to keep on going when this very worthwhile project you've been involved with has turned out to be a long one, and just how did you keep going? What kept you going and to persevere here to the end?
Well, I can say prayers and encouragement to many people. I think that would be one thing. I think it's keeping the aim in view. In our case, within Latin America, there's no Bible commentary that is from Latin America, that really is in the language of the heart and written to the context of Latin America. And as I travel around Latin America and go to churches, I see so many pastors who've never been to Bible college, and basically they're often tempted to preach sermons that are very superficial and very much on different subjects, and sometimes subjects that are getting to be really not very biblical at all. And that's really is a burden on my heart. So just seeing the context, seeing the need out there, and hearing other people say this, reporting the same matter, really. The enormous need to help pastors and church leaders and Bible study leaders to have resource to help them to dig into the Bible and apply the Bible to their own world is so important. So that really keeping that all of us involved, just to keep going, and despite the frustrations and the delays and all those sort of things, just to keep going and see finally it coming through. In fact, I have a copy here that I can sort of wave to you, which is of the first. It's actually a preliminary print run of the commentary after 11 years. So yeah, I think you do need to pray that the Lord will give perseverance and constancy, just to see these things through. I think inevitably it's one of those things that whenever you make a plan to do something, it's very easy to be too optimistic and to think, oh yeah, we can take so many months to do this, so many months to do that. But just things happen on the way, and so you need to be prepared to adjust your plans and just keep going if that's the case. And I think very much the encouragement from other publishers, other people involved in the same ministry, in the family of MAI, for example, of folk who have also been through the same experience in a different way and have struggled, and but finally seen the book coming out at the end. So all those things are important. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, congratulations. We'll all give you a virtual applause for coming to the end of the project, and we look forward to seeing it out there. I'm not seeing any further questions. I'd like to conclude with a couple of announcements, but before I do that, Ian, do you have any closing words, or?
Well, actually, maybe on a completely pastoral side, I think one does need to guard our own hearts when I think when you're involved in any project that has frustrations. I think we need to be very careful to guard our own hearts to make sure that we don't get negative feelings or poor me type feeling, and just pray that the Lord will help us to keep our eyes fixed on Him and fixed on the target, as it were. And I would say also, because inevitably, if we're involved in this sort of thing, we spend a lot of time replying to emails, following people up, and so on. So we spend a lot of time at our desks. So take care of yourself physically too. And so eat sensibly, don't put on too much weight. And I'm sure John would agree, get out and run, keep yourself fit. And I think sometimes overnight I've had things in mind and frustrations, and pray about it, but also to go out for a run in the fresh air, and that exercise will help me to return home with thinking, no, this isn't that big a problem after all. And so I think we just need to realize we are human beings. We are, some of us are getting older, and we need to take care of ourselves spiritually and physically and mentally too.
Thank you, Ian. I see a comment here. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I think all of us would like to do that. Very helpful presentation, so thanks so much. I'd like to say to you who are participating today that if you'd like to meet Ian in person and ask some more questions, go to Lit World. Actually, tomorrow is the registration deadline for the Lit World Conference in Singapore, which is October 28th to November 2nd. We've got about 200 or so participants registered so far. We'd love to have you there with us. You can find out more on the website, on the MAI website. And then also next month will be another webinar on September 11th, and the topic will be how to write biblical fiction, led by Misu Andrews. So we'd like to invite you back again for next month's webinar. So Ian, I want to thank you again, and we'll just say goodbye. And again, thank you so much for all of you taking time in your busy schedules to learn and to grow through these training webinars. So we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye-bye.